The lamplighter had already passed. Sauchiehall Street glistened black with rain, and the gas jets hissed against the damp. Inside a narrow bedroom above the shop, a woman lay burning without fever, her lips cracked, her breath thin as paper. She had asked for water an hour before. She had asked for her mother, who was already dead in the room across the landing. On the washstand, a small glass held the last of the draught her husband had mixed for her, still faintly sweet, still faintly bitter beneath. He sat beside her in his good black coat, holding her hand, whispering that she would be well by morning. Outside, a horse went by on the wet stones. The clock in the hall struck one, and Mary Pritchard closed her eyes for the final time. The doctor of Sauchiehall Street. "Good evening, and welcome. I hope you have found somewhere warm to lie down, and I hope the light is low. My name is your bedside historian, and this is the channel where we go looking, together, for the parts of the past that the daylight world does not much like to hold. Before we begin, tell me, if you would, where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what hour it has become on your side of the dark. A bedroom in the north of England, a flat in Manila, a truck cab pulled off some long American road. Wherever you are, and whatever the hour, I am glad of your company. If the channel has kept you company more than once, and if you can spare the 10 seconds it takes, please subscribe and press the like on this video before you drift. It costs you nothing, and it is the whole of how a very odd little history channel keeps going. Now let the room around you fall away. We are going back 160 years or so. We are going to a city that smelled of coal smoke and river water and horse sweat. A city stitched from stone and iron, under a sky that was almost always some shade of grey. We are going to Glasgow in the 1860s, when the shipyards on the Clyde ran day and night, when the tenements climbed 6 stories into the rain, and when a well-dressed doctor with a fine beard and a soft manner kept a brass plate on a door in the West End, above a busy street. The street was Sauchiehall Street, and the doctor was named Edward William Pritchard. To picture the street as he knew it, you have to strip a great deal away. The trams that came later, the electric lights, the picture houses, the shop fronts of glass and gilt. None of that is yet in place. In the 1860s, Sauchiehall Street was a busy thoroughfare of terraces and workshops, of drapers and confectioners and tea merchants, of small hotels and boarding houses that let rooms by the week. The pavements were flagstones, uneven where the ground had shifted. The road itself was granite set, laid in fans, and it rang under iron wheels from before first light. Horses passed all day, drays and gigs and the tall carriages of the well-to-do, and behind them the crossing sweepers pushed the dung into the gutters with brooms of birch twigs. The air carried coal smoke from 10,000 hearths, and under the coal smoke the wet mineral smell of the Clyde, and under that the tang of the tanneries eastward and the breweries southward. In summer it was thick, in winter it was thicker. At night the gas lamps came on one by one, the lamplighter running his long pole along the row, and the mantles hissed and flared and settled to a pale yellow light that did not reach the upper stories. Then Sauchiehall Street became a river of shadow, with points of fire along its banks, and the shop windows glowed in patches, and the wet stones threw back the light in broken pieces. It was into that street, from a house set a little back from the pavement, that Dr Pritchard would step out most evenings to take the air. He wore a black frock coat, well cut and well brushed. He wore a tall silk hat. He carried a cane with a silver top, and he touched his hat to the ladies of the parish with a grave, unhurried courtesy. Let me pause here for just a moment. I want you to understand something before we go any further, because it matters to every hour that will follow. The man we are about to walk with was not, to look at, a monster. He was the opposite. He was handsome, in a full-bearded, mid-Victorian way, with grey eyes and a broad forehead, and hair that he oiled and combed back from his temples. He was tall for his time, close to 6 feet, and he carried himself with the posture of a former naval man, which is what he was. He spoke well, he wrote well, he gave lectures at temperance societies, and at Masonic lodges, and at literary institutes across the west of Scotland, and the notices in the newspapers of the day describe him again and again as fluent, agreeable, gentlemanly. If you had passed him on Sauchiehall Street on a bright afternoon in 1863, you would have thought only that a well-mannered doctor was going about his rounds. You would have raised your hat, and he would have raised his in return, and you would have gone on with your day, and thought no more about it. That is a large part of the horror of this story. Not that a villain wore a mask, that is common, but that the mask fitted him so well, for so long, that many who knew him best never once suspected what lived underneath. Edward William Pritchard was born in the south of England, in Southsea on the Hampshire coast, in the year 1825. His father was a naval man, and the sea was the family trade, and it was assumed from the start that the boy would follow it. He was apprenticed young to a surgeon at Portsmouth, and he studied at the Royal College of Surgeons in London, and by the age of 21 he had gone into the Royal Navy as an assistant surgeon aboard a small warship. He served, over the next several years, on stations across the world. He sailed to the Falklands, to the West Indies, to the Mediterranean. He amputated legs in ships' cockpits by the light of horn lanterns while the deck rolled under him. He watched men die of yellow fever and of dysentery. He read a great deal in the long, empty months at sea, and he formed the taste for public speaking that never afterwards left him. The record does not quite say where his ambition took its final turn. Somewhere in those naval years he decided that the life of a ship's surgeon was too narrow, and too obscure, and too poorly paid for a man of his gifts. He wanted a house. He wanted an income. He wanted, above all, to be known. So he left the Navy and he came ashore. In 1850, at Portsmouth, he married a young woman named Mary Jane Taylor. She was the daughter of a respectable silk merchant from Edinburgh, of a Presbyterian family of some standing, and she had been sent south to visit relations when he met her. She was 22. He was 25. The wedding was reported, briefly, in the local press. There is a photograph of her that has come down to us from later in the marriage, taken in Glasgow. It shows a woman with a wide face and heavy dark hair, and eyes that look, even through the long exposure of a Victorian plate, uncommonly kind. Whatever she saw in him on the day she took his name, she seems to have gone on believing it, more or less, until the last week of her life. They settled first in Yorkshire, in the little town of Filey, and he took over a country practice there. He was busy enough. He rode out to farmhouses in the small hours to deliver babies by rushlight. He set the broken arms of fishermen on the North Sea coast. He gave lectures in the assembly rooms on the wonders of the tropics, embroidered a little further each year, and his neighbours came out to hear him, and laughed and clapped in the right places. In those Yorkshire years the couple had their first children. They lost one, an infant, as so many families did in that century, and buried it in the churchyard by the sea. And here, already, the first faint shadow of what he would become begins to fall across the record, because it is at Filey that we first hear the rumours. I have to be careful with these. The rumours from Filey did not, at the time, come to anything. They were the kind of soft, uneasy talk that a small English town will attach to a doctor who is too handsome and too fond of the sound of his own voice. A housemaid who left the doctor's employment abruptly. A patient's wife who blushed and would not say why. Letters that certain husbands intercepted and burned. None of it reached a court. None of it reached a newspaper. It is the sort of thing that history preserves only as a low murmur, half heard through a closed door, and I would not put much weight on it, except that later, when everything else came out, several people from Filey remembered those months and said, quietly and to one another, that they had wondered, even then. The Pritchards did not stay in Yorkshire. In 1860, or thereabouts, they came north, into Scotland, and they made their home in Glasgow. He first practised in a house on Berkeley Terrace, at the western end of Sauchiehall Street, where the pavements ran out toward the fields beyond Charing Cross. Later he moved eastward, closer to the busy part of the street, and it was there, at number 131 Sauchiehall Street, that he set up the household that we will spend the rest of our nights inside. The house was tall and thin, 4 stories of Glasgow sandstone, with a shop below and the consulting room on the ground floor, and the family rooms above. On the ground floor door he screwed a fresh brass plate. It read, in engraved capitals, Edward William Pritchard, M.D. He polished it himself, most mornings, with a scrap of chamois and a little rouge. We should stop for a moment on that brass plate, because it is doing more work than it seems. The letters after his name were a lie. He was not, in fact, a doctor of medicine in the full academic sense. He had bought, from a small and not entirely reputable university in Germany, a doctorate that could be had by post for a fee, and he wore it in Glasgow as though it were the same thing as an Edinburgh degree. He was, in law, a licentiate of the Royal College of Surgeons, which is a real qualification, but not the one he chose to display. This mattered less to his patients than you might think. Working people in Glasgow in the 1860s needed a doctor who would come when called, and who would set a fever with quinine and a cough with ipecacuanha, and a broken wrist with a splint, and who would take their shilling without complaint. Pritchard did all of that. His waiting room, on most mornings, was full. He was, by every account, kind to his poorest patients. He would sit longer than he needed to at their bedsides. He would leave a bottle of medicine without insisting on payment. This too is part of what makes the whole story so difficult, because none of that kindness was ever proved to have been a performance. It seems, quite genuinely, to have coexisted in him with everything else he was. Come with me, for a moment, up the stairs of that house. Behind the consulting room, up the first flight, a landing gave onto the dining room, wallpapered in a heavy dark green, with a long mahogany table that could seat 10, and a sideboard on which sat a decanter of sherry and a matching one of whisky, and a locked tantalus that held the good brandy. Above that were the drawing room and the master bedroom, where Mary Jane kept her workbox and her prayer book, and a small daguerreotype of her mother on the mantelpiece. Above that were the children's rooms. There were, by the time this story begins in earnest, 5 children. Jane Frances, the eldest, a serious girl of 11, who could already read her father's medical books when he was not looking. Charles Edward, the eldest son, 9 years old, who wanted to be a soldier. Catherine, 7, Ellen, 5, and the baby, Frederick, who was still in his cradle and slept badly. Above them again, in the attic, slept the maids. I want you to notice, as we stand on that landing, that this is a house full of women, the doctor, and one very small boy, and one somewhat older boy who was often at school. That was the male half. Everyone else who lived under that roof, or who worked in it, or who came to visit, was female: his wife, his 4 daughters, the nurse for the baby, the cook, the kitchen maid, the housemaid, and, in due course, the mother-in-law from Edinburgh, who is already gathering her black bombazine and her sewing basket, in the winter to come, in a house on Lauriston Place, and getting ready to catch the train west. It is a household in which a certain kind of man could move as king, and Pritchard, in his own house, was king. On a good evening in the summer of 1862, before any of what is coming has yet begun, you might have seen him at the head of that dining table, carving the mutton himself, telling one of his long naval stories about a night in Havana or a storm off Madeira, the children laughing at the parts they were meant to laugh at, Mary Jane smiling at him from the far end of the table with the tired fondness of a woman who has heard the story before and does not mind hearing it again. The gas was turned up, the fire was lit, the rain was going along the window in slow lines. Outside on Sauchiehall Street, the lamplighter was moving from post to post, and the shop below the house had shut for the night, and the door with the brass plate on it was locked from the inside. It is that house, exactly that house, that we will not leave now for many hours. We will follow it through one full turn of the year, and then another. We will meet everyone who lived in it, and everyone who came into it, and, in the end, everyone who was carried out of it. And we will try, as best we can, to keep our eyes on the man in the black coat at the head of the table, because he is going to try, very hard, not to let us. For now, though, the fire is dying down, and the plates have been cleared, and Mary Jane has gone upstairs to see to the baby, and the doctor is sitting alone in the dining room with a small glass of whisky in his hand, watching the last of the coals. The clock on the mantel ticks. The house above him settles. And somewhere, out in the wet Glasgow night, a young country girl named Elizabeth McGrain is packing her few clothes into a bundle, because in a matter of weeks she is coming into service at number 131 Sauchiehall Street, and taking a bed in the attic that she will never, in the end, leave alive. A household of women. I'll generate Chapter 2 now, holding to the master prompt's rules on voice, rhythm, and era-authentic detail. Let us climb the stairs together for a moment, you and I, before the rest of the story starts to move. I want you to know the shape of this house from the inside, because everything that comes after happens inside these rooms, and it will help you if you can picture where each door leads. Take my hand on the banister. It is polished walnut, and it turns at each landing with a carved newel in the shape of an acorn. The runner underfoot is turkey red, worn to a duller shade in the middle of each tread, from 12 years of feet going up and down. Gas jets burn on brackets at each half landing, turned low, and they leave a warm brown smell in the stairwell that mixes with beeswax and, faintly, with the coal from the kitchen range 2 floors below. Now let the picture settle. This is the world Mary Jane Pritchard governed, and it is the world she was proud of. She was 38 years old in the autumn of 1864. She had been a wife for 14 years, and a mother for most of them. The photograph of her that survives, taken by a Glasgow studio on Buchanan Street, shows a woman in a dark bombazine dress with a lace collar pinned at the throat by a mourning brooch that held a lock of her lost baby's hair. And this detail alone tells you a great deal about how the women of that century wore their grief. Her face was full, with a good high colour, and her dark hair was parted straight down the middle and drawn back over the ears in the way the magazines then called Madonna bands. She wrote a firm, round hand in her housekeeping book. She kept the family accounts to the last farthing. She ordered the joints from the butcher on West Nile Street, and the tea from a merchant on Argyle Street, and the linen from Wiley and Lockheads when it came in from Belfast. On a Sunday morning, she walked the children up the hill to the Free Church on Hope Street, in a procession of black gloves and hymn books, and every soul in the pew knew her by name. The record is generous with her in one way, and thin in another. We know a great deal about what she did. We know very little about what she thought. She left no diary. She left almost no letters, and the ones that survive are the polite, careful notes that a middle-class Victorian wife wrote to her aunts about the health of the children and the price of coal, what she thought of her husband in the private hours, whether she ever paused in the passageway outside his consulting room and wondered at any of it, we simply do not have. It is one of the honest gaps in this whole history. I can tell you what she wore, and what she ate, and what she signed her name to in the parish book. I cannot tell you what kept her awake at 3 in the morning, if anything did. I have to leave that space blank, because the past has left it blank, and I would rather it stayed empty than let me fill it with a guess. Now, come with me down the passage from the master bedroom. The floorboards give a little as you cross the sill. Turn right, and you are at the door of the nursery. There were 5 living children in that house in the year the trouble began. The eldest was Jane Frances, called Janie inside the family, aged 11, tall for her age, and grave in the manner of eldest daughters everywhere. She wore a pinafore of white cotton over a wool dress, dyed the colour of a chestnut, and she read her way steadily through the shelves of her father's study, whether he permitted it or not. She could, by the winter of 1863, read a page of medical Latin and make a fair guess at the meaning. Her governess said of her, in a letter to a friend, that she was a child of unusual sense, and that Mrs. Pritchard depended on her more than perhaps a mother should on a girl of that age. Next was Charles Edward, aged 9, in a jacket of navy blue serge with brass buttons his father had bought for him from a chandler on the Broomielaw, and he wanted, above everything, to go to sea. Then came Catherine, aged 7, then Ellen, aged 5, and last of all the baby, Frederick, who had been born the year before and who slept in a walnut cradle by his mother's side of the bed. He was a fretful sleeper. He teethed hard, and his gums bled sometimes into his linen bib. The children ate their supper apart from the parents, in the schoolroom at the back of the first floor, at a scrubbed pine table with a jug of milk in the middle and a plate of bread and dripping. On Sundays they were brought down for the midday meal, scrubbed and buttoned, and Dr. Pritchard would carve the mutton with a great flourish and ask them each in turn what they had learned that week from their catechism. Janie answered clearly. Charles mumbled. Catherine and Ellen giggled behind their napkins until their mother's eye stopped them, and Mary Jane's eye was quick. It was a household, from the children's point of view, of routines. Prayers at a set hour, meals at a set hour, bed at a set hour. The father coming and going, warm one day and short the next, but never violent, never in drink at the family table, always the doctor when strangers were watching. That is what the surviving children later told their guardians, when there were no parents left to protect. It was, they said, an ordinary childhood, until it was not. Come up one more flight with me. The stair narrows here, and the runner ends, and the treads are bare pine. The gas does not reach this landing. You would have carried a candle in a tin holder, shielding the flame with your other hand. This is the attic, and this is where the servants slept. There were 3 of them, most of the time, a cook, a housemaid, and a nursemaid for the baby. They kept the house in the way every middle-class Glasgow house was kept in the 1860s, which is to say that they got up in the dark and did not sit down again until it was dark once more. The cook in this house was a stout woman named Catherine Latimer, who had come out of a farm in Lanarkshire, and who could kill a chicken with one twist of her hands and never spot her apron. She was up at 5:30 to rake out the range and light the kindling. She had the kettle on the boil by 6. She baked the household bread twice a week, and she made the porridge every morning in a black iron pot with a wooden stick that had been used for that one purpose for so many years that the salt had bleached the wood white. The housemaid emptied the chamber pots, blacked the grates in every room, carried up the cans of hot water for the washstands, and dusted the drawing room on her hands and knees. The nursemaid slept in a truckle bed at the foot of Mary Jane's, so that she could reach the baby before the mistress woke. The wages, for the sake of the record, were about £10 a year for the cook, £6 or £7 a year for the housemaid, and rather less for the nursemaid, along with all found, that is to say, their board, their bed, their firewood, their tea and their sugar, and one Sunday afternoon off in every 4. £10 a year, in Glasgow in the 1860s, was roughly what a manual labourer earned in 3 months. For a country girl coming into service in a doctor's house on Sauchiehall Street, it was a respectable place, and there was competition for it. Girls came in from the Highlands. Girls came in from Ireland by the packet boat to the Broomielaw. Girls came in from the mining villages of Ayrshire when their fathers could no longer feed them. They knocked at the tradesman's door in the basement area, and they curtsied to Mrs. Pritchard in the kitchen, and if they were taken, they went up to that attic and were shown their bed. One of those girls was Elizabeth McGrain. She was 16 years old, or thereabouts, when she came into the household late in 1862. She was from the country west of Glasgow, a farmer's daughter from Kilbarcan, or thereabouts. The parish record spells it one way and her death certificate another, and I have never been able to work out which was truer, so I will simply say she was a country girl from the west. She had a broad face and freckles across her nose, and she wore, on her first morning, a cotton dress that had been made for her elder sister and taken in at the waist with pins. Mary Jane took to her at once. Elizabeth was quick with the baby and cheerful with the older children, and she had the good country manner of a girl who has been brought up to say her prayers and take the ashes out without being asked. Within a few months she was doing more than her share, and Mary Jane was writing home to Edinburgh, to her mother, that they had been fortunate at last in getting a really willing girl. I want you to hold Elizabeth's name in your mind, if you can, because her name is going to come up again very soon, and I do not want you to lose track of her. Elizabeth McGrain, 16 years old, freckled, from the country west of Glasgow, the willing girl who sleeps at the top of the house. Everything else on this floor, the pine table and the tin candlestick, and the shared bed with a striped ticking mattress, and the china jug on the washstand, is common to 100,000 Glasgow attics of that year. She is the particular soul we came here to find. Now let me take you back down, all the way down, past the nursery, and past the drawing room, and past the consulting room with the brass plate on the door, out into the wet street, and eastward. We have to go, for a moment, to Edinburgh. It will not take long. Turn the picture on its edge. See a stone terrace on Lauriston Place, in the shadow of the old George Heriot School, with a wrought-iron balcony and a boot-scraper set into the flag. It is the winter of the same year. Behind one of those doors lives a widow in her middle 60s, a woman of Presbyterian solidity and Edinburgh good sense, named Jane Taylor. She is the mother of Mary Jane Pritchard, and she is, at this point in the story, in health. Jane Taylor had been born in Edinburgh in the last years of the 18th century. She had married a silk merchant. She had raised her children in comfort and buried her husband in the Grange cemetery and taken over the management of the small estate he left her, with the help of a solicitor on George Street who admired her firmness. She kept a household of her own, a companion, a housekeeper, a maid, and she saw her daughter in Glasgow only 2 or 3 times a year, coming by the Caledonian Railway from Princes Street in a black travelling dress and a bonnet trimmed with jet. The two women wrote to each other every week without fail. Mary Jane sent long, gossipy letters about the children. Jane Taylor sent back short, briskly practical replies about linen and lozenges, and the doctor at Charing Cross who had a new sort of tonic for children's coughs. She was not a sentimental woman, but she loved her daughter without measure, in her plain, unshowy way, and she had a private view about her son-in-law that she did not often share, and that her letters, careful as they were, sometimes let slip. She thought Edward William Pritchard was a fool, not a criminal. That would come later, and even then she would have used harder words than fool. In the winter of 1863, before any of the trouble began, what she chiefly held against him was his vanity. She had watched him at the dinner table on her last visit, holding forth on the tropics, and she had noticed the way his eyes moved along the row of faces to see which of them was most impressed. She thought him showy. She thought him too fond of his own reflection in the glass over the mantelpiece. She thought him a spender when his practice would have supported thrift, and she thought, most quietly of all, that Mary Jane was tireder than a woman of 38 in comfortable circumstances ought to be. She did not yet think it meant anything. That is a house, then, on the eve of what is coming. A doctor at the head of the table, in a good coat, admired by his neighbours. A wife who kept the ledger and ran the linen press, and loved him without asking too many questions. 5 children in the rooms above, 3 girls and 2 boys, the eldest already reading her father's books. 3 maids in the attic, and among them a freckled country girl of 16 who slept nearest the little window that looked out over the roof of the shop next door. A mother-in-law in Edinburgh, with a sharp Presbyterian eye, still writing her weekly letter. Beyond the walls, a city of coal smoke and stone. Above the walls, a sky of low grey cloud. Everything in its place, and everyone under one roof. And the brass plate on the front door polished every morning by the master of the house with a scrap of chamois and a little rouge. It looks, from the pavement, like a household in order. You have to remember that from the pavement was where the doctor most wanted it to look from. This was, in the end, his particular kind of cleverness. He understood, better than most men understand it, that a household in order is a household no one asks questions about. So he kept it, publicly, in order. He carved the mutton on Sundays. He walked with his wife on his arm to the Free Church. He gave his sixpences to the beggar at the corner of Buchanan Street. He was seen, and he wished to be seen, and he took very great care over what was seen. What was not seen is what we will come to next. Because the winter of 1862 ran into the spring of 1863, and the days lengthened, and the coal fires in the upper rooms were let go out for the season, and up in the attic Elizabeth Magrain fell into her narrow bed each night after 18 hours on her feet, and slept the sleep of a country girl who is not yet afraid of anything. In a matter of weeks, on a night in May of that year, the house on Sauchiehall Street would wake to the smell of smoke drifting down the stairwell, and to a red light flickering on the ceiling of the landing outside the master bedroom. And the calm doctor with the polished plate would step out onto the wet pavement, in his shirt-sleeves, and stand with the neighbours in the light of the flames and watch the top of his own house burn. The fire in the attic. Come with me now to a night in May of 1863. Before we go into the room where this chapter belongs, I should say one thing plainly, because I do not want you to be confused, and because a bedside historian who lies by accident is no better than one who lies on purpose. The tall house on Sauchiehall Street that we have been climbing these last 2 nights, with the brass plate and the walnut banister and the shop below, is not the house that will burn tonight. That address comes a little later. Tonight we are going back a season, and a good stretch further west, to an older terrace at the outer end of Berkeley Terrace, which is where the doctor and his wife and their children were living, in the spring of 1863, 3 stories instead of 4. A short flight of stone steps up to the front door. The same brass plate, freshly cut. The same attic at the top, under a slate roof, with 3 narrow beds along the eaves. Elizabeth McGrain was in one of those beds by 10 o'clock, which was late for her. Her day had begun at 5:30, in the cold of a Glasgow spring dawn, and it had not much stopped between then and the hour she came up to the attic with her candle in a tin holder. She had blacked the grates in the drawing room and the master bedroom. She had drawn the water for the family baths from the copper in the scullery, 4 cans of it, up 2 flights each time. She had run out to the shop on Elderslie Street for a paper of pins for Mrs. Pritchard's workbox. She had sat with baby Frederick when the nursemaid was sent for a cough draught, and she had rocked him in her arms in the schoolroom, singing him a country lullaby about a boat on Loch Winnoch, until his eyes closed. When she came up to the attic at last, her feet were sore inside her boots, and her wrist ached from wringing sheets in cold water in the wash-house that morning. She did what she always did before she slept. She untied her apron and folded it. She knelt for a moment beside the bed, in her shift, and said her prayers in the plain form her mother had taught her at home in the country. She got into bed, and she reached for the book that she had borrowed the week before from the maid 2 houses down, a paper-covered novel about a soldier and a Highland girl, with the corner turned down at page 41. She lit the wick of her candle on the pine box beside the bed, drew the blanket up, and began to read. The record does not say what page she reached. The next thing the record has is a smell. It was Catherine Latimer, the cook from the Lanarkshire farm, who caught it first, and she caught it from the bottom of the house, not the top. She had gone down to the kitchen a little after midnight to put a kettle on the range for the doctor, because he had said, when he came home late from a visit, that he might like a cup of something hot before bed. She stood at the range in her nightdress and her wrap, waiting for the water to come to the whisper, and she noticed that the air in the kitchen had begun to move oddly, drawing under the door as if a chimney somewhere had gone wrong. She thought at first it was a jackdaw's nest come loose in the flue. Then she smelled it, not the honest smoke of a coal fire, something sharper, wool and paper and pine. She went out into the passage, and she looked up the stairwell, and she saw a thin grey ribbon of smoke coming down from the top floor and moving along the ceiling toward her. Catherine Latimer, being a farm woman, did not scream. She turned on her heel and went straight to the doctor's bedroom door and rattled the handle and called out, twice, that the house was afire and that the mistress and the bairns must come down at once. Dr Pritchard came into the passage in his shirt and his trousers, his hair on one side of his head still flat from the pillow, and he took the situation in with the odd, clear look that some men have when they have already decided how they mean to behave. He told her to go for the children. He himself, he said, would go up to the attic and see to the maids. She went along the landing to the nursery. Mary Jane was already at the doorway in her nightgown, the baby in her arms, the older children behind her rubbing their eyes. They went down the stairs together in a knot, the housemaid coming last with the little one's shoes in one hand. Out on the pavement of Berkeley Terrace, in the cold hour after midnight, the whole household stood barefoot on the flagstones and watched the top of their own house begin to glow. By this time a neighbour on the other side of the terrace had come out too, in his overcoat over his nightshirt, and another had run for the police from the corner box. The Glasgow Fire Brigade in 1863 was still a modest force, kept in a shed on College Street with a hand-drawn engine and a team of 9 men, and it took a full quarter of an hour before you could hear the wheels of it coming down the wet stones from the east. By then the attic window at the front was showing a steady orange square, and a black scarf of smoke was going straight up into the low cloud above the roof. The doctor was on the pavement in his shirt sleeves. Every eye that later gave evidence remembered the same thing about him, and remembered it separately, which is why I am willing to tell you as fact that this is how he stood. He stood with his arms loose at his sides. He did not shout for a ladder. He did not weep for the girl in the attic. He looked up at the burning window, and he said, to no one in particular but loud enough for the neighbours to hear, that he had gone up as far as the attic stair and been driven back by the heat, and that poor Elizabeth must be beyond help now. Then he turned to his wife, who was sitting on the low wall of the area with the baby pressed to her shoulder, and he asked her whether she was warm enough, and he took off his own coat, which he had picked up on the way out, and he laid it around her shoulders. A woman 2 doors down, giving evidence at a place none of them yet knew they were going, would say afterwards that this was the moment she first felt something was wrong. She could not, she said, put a name to it then. But she remembered thinking, as she watched him tuck the collar of the coat around his wife's neck, that a man whose servant was at that moment burning to death in his own attic ought to have looked, at the least, like a man who wished the ladder would come faster. The ladder came, the engine came. The men in their leather helmets worked the handles of the pump in pairs, 6 of them at a time, and a chain of buckets went from the standpipe on the corner to the front door and up the stairs. The fire was chiefly in the attic and in the roof space above it, and it was got under, in the end, in less than an hour. The lower floors were saved. The consulting room on the ground floor did not even take smoke damage on the wallpaper. But when the men in the leather helmets came down the stair at last, they came down carrying, on a folded blanket between them, what had been Elizabeth Magrain. I am not going to describe her body to you. That is not what this channel is for, and it is not what you came to listen to at this hour. I will say only that she was in her bed, and that her hand had been near the pine box on which the candle had stood, and that the fire had begun in that corner of the room, close to where she slept. The inquest was held within days, at the coroner's rooms in the city, and the verdict came back at once. Death by misadventure. The finding was that the young woman, tired from her long day, had lit her candle to read her novel in bed, and had fallen asleep with the flame still burning, and that the flame had caught in the bedding or in the paper of her book, and that from there it had gone into the mattress and into the pine box, and into the sloping ceiling above her head. No one was blamed, the family was pitied. A short paragraph appeared in the North British Daily Mail, expressing sympathy with Dr Pritchard on the loss of a faithful servant. The insurance on the house was paid out in full, some weeks later, without any question being asked. And that, in the eye of the public record, was the end of the matter. It was not the end of the matter. It is only the end of the part that anyone chose to write down. 2 things, both hushed, sit in the gap between what was said at the inquest and what other people later remembered. The first is that Elizabeth Magrain, on the evening of the fire, was seen by the housemaid to take a glass of something the doctor had poured for her, in the kitchen, before she went up to bed. The housemaid, giving her account years afterward, said that Elizabeth had grimaced at the taste, and that the doctor had laughed, and said it would help her sleep, that she had been on her feet too long, and that a working girl deserved a physician's kindness now and then. The second is that Elizabeth, in the weeks before the fire, had told the same housemaid, in the wash-house one afternoon over the sheets, that she wished she could leave the doctor's employment, and that when the housemaid asked her why, Elizabeth had only shaken her head and said that some things a country girl did not know how to say. What she meant by that we cannot know. She did not live to say it more plainly. It is one of the honest silences of this story, and I would rather leave it a silence than pretend I can hear through the wall. There is one other thing, and then I will let this chapter close. 2 nights after the fire, when the family had been taken in by friends and the shell of the house on Berkeley Terrace stood empty behind boarded windows, the doctor was seen back on the pavement in front of it, on his own, in his black coat and his tall hat, looking up at the burnt attic in the light of the corner lamp. He stood there for some minutes. He did not weep. He did not pray. A watchman going by on his rounds nodded to him, and he touched his hat in return, quite properly, and said good evening, and then he turned and walked away east along Sauchiehall Street, toward Charing Cross, where the pavements ran on into the busier part of the town, and where, within the year, he would take the lease on a tall, thin house of 4 stories, with a shop below and a fresh brass plate to come. The rain began again as he walked. The gas jets hissed, and somewhere behind him in the boarded house, the smell of burnt pine and burnt wool went on drifting up the stairwell into the dark, into the empty attic, where the pine box beside the bed had been reduced to a handful of black splinters, and the mattress on which Elizabeth Magrain had said her country prayers was a scorched shape on the floor under a hole in the roof, through which, if you had stood in the room and looked up, you would have seen the low Glasgow cloud passing over. The sweetness in the cup, I'll write chapter 4 now, keeping the pace slower than the fire chapter and letting the sweetness of the draft do the work quietly. Let me settle you first. If you drifted for a while during the last part, that is exactly right, and you have missed nothing you cannot pick up again from here. We are in Glasgow still, in the tall, thin house at number 131 Sauchiehall Street, with the brass plate at the door and the shop below and the walnut banister that turns at each landing. The fire on Berkeley Terrace is more than a year behind us now. The doctor and his wife have moved east into the busier part of the town, and the season when this chapter begins is the autumn of 1864. The first thing to know is that Mary Jane Pritchard, at the end of that September, was well. She was 39 by then, and heavier than she had been as a bride, and she had begun to wear her hair in a looser style at the back of her head, because it eased the ache in her neck at the end of a long day of accounts. But her colour was good. She still walked the older children to school in the mornings, down the hill toward the academy on Elmbank Street, in a plaid shawl the colour of moss. She still ordered a shoulder of mutton for Sunday from the butcher on West Nile Street, and a pound of green tea from the merchant on Argyle Street, and a paper of camphor from the chemist on Sauchiehall Street itself, 3 doors east, whenever the linen press needed freshening for winter. Her handwriting in the housekeeping ledger for the last week of September, which the police would later hold in their gloved hands under a lamp in a room in the city, is firm and even and shows no tremor of any kind. The first entry that anyone could later read as a warning is dated the 14th of October, and it is not in her hand. It is in his. He wrote, in the diary he had kept since his student days in Leeds, that Mary Jane had been unwell in the night, and had cast up her supper, and that he had given her a draught of his own preparation, and that she had slept a little toward morning. He noted the pulse. He noted the colour of the tongue. He wrote of her with the tenderness of a man setting down, for himself alone, the trouble of a beloved wife. And then, in the very next line, he wrote out a receipt for a mixture of tartar emetic in sweetened water, in a hand as steady as if he were writing a prescription for a stranger who would call at the door in the morning. That is the first draft. That is the beginning of it. You need to know, before we go any further, what this mixture was, because the whole slow terror of this chapter turns on the taste of it, and on the fact that in a doctor's house in Glasgow in 1864 there was nothing in the world less suspect than a physician mixing a medicine for his own wife. Tartar emetic was a preparation of antimony, a metal that the apothecaries of that century kept in a squat green jar on the upper shelf. It came into the shop as a fine white powder, almost like caster sugar to the eye, with a faint metallic gleam if you tilted it toward the gaslight. On the tongue it tasted, in small measure, sweetish and then bitter, in the way a copper coin tastes if you hold it against the roof of your mouth. In tiny doses, it made a patient sick, on purpose, because doctors of that day still believed a great deal in emptying the stomach as a cure for almost everything. In larger and repeated doses it wasted the flesh. It brought cramps into the calves in the small hours. It hollowed the face. It dulled the eye. It let a woman keep her senses, and even her patience, while her body forgot how to hold itself upright in a chair. I do not want to make this sound clever. It was not clever. It was the oldest trick a bad physician has, and the doctor was using it on the mother of his own children. Take my hand for a moment, and come with me to the bedroom at the front of the house on Sauchiehall Street. The curtains are drawn against the afternoon. There is a coal fire in the grate, banked down to a red glow. A washstand in the corner holds a jug and a basin and a folded flannel. Mary Jane is in the bed, propped on 2 bolsters, in a nightdress of unbleached cotton, with a ribbon at the throat. Her hair has been braided for her by Janie, the eldest girl, and pinned back off her forehead. On the marble top of the little table by the bed stands a tumbler, and in the tumbler is an inch of a pale golden liquid, faintly cloudy, that her husband has just poured from a bottle he brought up from the consulting room. He sits beside her on a chair he has drawn close. He puts the tumbler into her hand and folds her fingers around it. He tells her to drink it slowly. He watches her drink. You are not in that room. You are on the landing outside, with me, and we are only listening. That matters. In every scene from here to the end of this story, you are the guest of a house that no one living can be warned. All you and I can do is watch, and not lie about what we see. Through the last 2 weeks of October, she was, in the language the household later used, poorly. She kept to her bed for a morning, and rose for the afternoon, and took a little arrowroot from a china cup at supper time. She was sick again in the night on the 21st. She was sick again on the 25th, more heavily, into a basin that Janey carried down herself to the scullery, rather than have the maid see it. She grew pale about the mouth. Her wedding ring, which had been tight on her finger since her third child, began to turn loosely when she moved her hand. The nursemaid noticed it while dressing the baby beside her, and thought at first that the mistress had been fasting, and asked her, in a low voice, whether she had been eating enough. Mary Jane laughed the question off. She said the doctor was looking after her. She said he had given her a fine tonic that made her queasy for an hour, but did her good, and that in a few days she would be back on her feet and going down the hill again in her shawl. She believed him. That is the part of this chapter that is hardest to sit with. She believed him utterly. In the letters she wrote to her mother in Edinburgh through October and November of that year, and there are 7 of them still in existence, folded in an archive box in a reading room where I once sat with them on a wet Tuesday afternoon, she does not once express a doubt about the man who was mixing her cups. She writes that Edward has been so patient with her. She writes that he sits up with her at night and reads aloud to her from the border ballads until she sleeps. She writes that he has refused to leave the house on his usual round of visits and has sent his patients instead to the doctor 2 doors down. She writes, in the letter of the 2nd of November, that she does not know how she should manage without him. He was writing letters of his own that autumn, and it is worth telling you what was in them, because they are what a jury would later be asked to weigh. He wrote to his brother-in-law Michael Taylor, Mary Jane's brother, who was a doctor himself down in Penrith, and he wrote in a tone of measured worry. He described her symptoms exactly and in the correct medical terms. He said that she had a gastric catarrh, that her appetite had failed, that her pulse was thin and quick, and that she was losing flesh at a rate that concerned him. He asked, in the tender manner of one physician appealing to another, whether Michael could think of anything else that might be tried. Michael wrote back with plain, sensible advice. Cool the room. Broth, not solids. Chamomile in water if she could keep it down. A doctor of the district to look at her, so that Edward himself was not the only voice in her room. In 3 consecutive letters that autumn, Edward Pritchard thanked his brother-in-law warmly, and did not send for the doctor of the district, and went on mixing his own draughts. We should say what we do not know. We do not know exactly when he first put the antimony into the tumbler. We do not know whether the very first draught, on the night of the 14th of October, was the beginning of the poisoning, or merely a real, honest, unlucky physician's mixture that happened to make her sick. Some historians of this case have argued the first, and some have argued the second, and I have gone back and forth about it myself, and found no way to settle it that would satisfy an honest jury. What we do know is that within a fortnight of that first entry in the diary, something in the tumbler was hurting her, and that within a month it was hurting her again and again, in a pattern too regular to be accident. And we know that he sat beside her every time she drank, and folded her fingers around the glass, and watched. The children saw a version of it and did not understand what they saw. Janey, aged 12 now, took over the running of the housekeeping ledger in the last week of October at her father's request, because her mother's eyes were tiring in the gaslight. Charles Edward, aged 10, was sent to school an hour earlier each morning so that the house should be less noisy for the invalid upstairs. Catherine and Ellen were told, gently, that Mamma had a stomachache that would not go away, and that they must not run on the landing outside her door, and that if she asked for water, they must call the maid and not carry the jug themselves, in case they spilled it on the rug. Baby Frederick was moved out of the master bedroom and down to a cot in the nursery, where the nursemaid could sit with him through the night without the crying of a teething child disturbing his mother's rest. You will notice, if you listen closely to any Victorian illness of this shape, that all of these arrangements are exactly the arrangements a loving husband would have made. That is the trick of it. Every step Edward Pritchard took in the household through October and November of 1864 was the step of a good doctor and a devoted husband. He darkened the room. He quieted the children. He sat up in the night. He wrote patient, tender letters to the family. He refused to leave her side. Any neighbour looking through the fanlight of number 131 Sauchiehall Street in those weeks would have said, without hesitation, that Mrs. Pritchard was fortunate in her husband, and that if she came through this trouble, it would be because of him. That is what most of them did say when they were asked afterward, and some of them said it with tears in their eyes. By the first week of December she was worse. She could no longer stand at the washstand without holding onto the marble edge of it with both hands. Her hair, when Janey combed it out at bedtime, came away in the comb in soft brown handfuls. She had begun to have a dryness in the mouth that no amount of barley water could ease. She lay in the bed in a sort of watchful patience, waiting for the next spasm in the stomach, and when it came she turned her face aside into the pillow and did not cry out, because she did not want the children on the floor below to hear her. Late one evening in that first week of December, sitting up alone in the bed after her husband had gone downstairs to see a patient at the surgery door, Mary Jane wrote a short letter in pencil on a torn half-sheet, and she folded it small, and she gave it in the morning to the housemaid to take to the post. It was to her mother, Jane Taylor, in Lauriston Place, Edinburgh. It said only that she had been ill for many weeks now, and that Edward was doing his best, but that she was tired past telling, and that she thought if her mother could see her way to coming north on the railway for a little while, it might raise her spirits more than any medicine, and would her mother be able to come. The letter went into the leather bag of the postman at the corner of Sauchiehall Street on a Tuesday morning, and it went south through Battock and into the streets of Edinburgh by that same evening, and it was carried up the stone steps of the terrace on Lauriston Place, and put into the gloved hand of the widow who lived behind that door. Jane Taylor read it standing in her own hallway, in her outdoor bonnet. She read it twice. Then she went straight to the sideboard in the dining room and took down her writing case and sent word by return that she would be on the train to Glasgow within the week. Downstairs, in the front hall of the house on Sauchiehall Street, the doctor took the reply from the boy at the door and read it standing under the gas jet. He folded it very neatly along its own crease. He put it into the inside pocket of his coat. He went up the stairs, past the drawing room and past the nursery, to the door of the master bedroom, where his wife was lying in the half-dark, with her eyes closed and her hand resting on the edge of the tumbler on the marble top. He sat down beside her, as he had sat down every evening now for 6 weeks. He picked up her hand. He told her, in a quiet, kind voice, that her mother was coming from Edinburgh at the end of the week, and would sit with her, and would help her back to strength. Mary Jane opened her eyes at that, and turned her face toward him, and smiled for the first time in 3 days. He smiled back, and he lifted the tumbler from the marble top with his other hand, and he brought it gently toward her lips. The mother from Edinburgh. Come with me now to the platform at Queen Street Station on a wet afternoon in the second week of December, 1864. The train from Edinburgh has just come in under the great iron and glass, and a plume of white steam is still hanging along the length of it, drifting up into the girders, and being caught there among the sooted panes. Doors are opening down the line of carriages. Porters are lifting boxes down onto the flags, and out of a second-class compartment near the front, a small grey-haired woman of 70 is being helped down by the guard, in a black bonnet with a veil turned back, and a black cloth cloak, and a plain wedding ring worn thin as wire on her left hand. That is Jane Taylor, the widow of Michael Taylor of Lauriston Place, and the mother of Mary Jane Pritchard. She had a leather bag in her right hand and an umbrella in her left, and she had, in the pocket of her cloak, the folded letter in pencil from her daughter, which had reached her by the evening post 4 days before. Her son, Dr. Michael Taylor, had come as far as the station in Edinburgh with her that morning to see her onto the train, and he had put his hand on the door of the carriage before it closed and asked her, plainly, whether she would send him word the moment she had seen her sister and knew how things stood. She had promised him she would. Now, in the noise of Queen Street under the low winter cloud, she stood on the platform and looked for the tall figure of her son-in-law in his black coat, coming toward her, along the line of steam. He was there. He was polite. He kissed her on the cheek. He took her bag from her hand and gave her his arm and walked her out through the booking hall to the cab rank, and he handed her up into a growler waiting under the lamp, and he sat opposite her with his hat on his knee as the cab pulled away west along George Street towards Sauchiehall. He asked after her journey. He asked after her son. He said, in a low voice, that Mary Jane had been asking for her since the letter went off, and that she would rest easier for hearing her mother's step on the stair. He did not tell her, in the cab, how thin her daughter had grown. "I want you to hold on to that, because it is the smallest kindness a husband could offer a mother travelling through a wet afternoon toward a sick child," and he did not offer it. He let her come up the walnut stair at number 131 Sauchiehall Street, and along the landing, and to the door of the front bedroom, and open that door herself. And what she saw inside stopped her in the doorway with her gloved hand on the frame. Mary Jane, propped on 3 bolsters now instead of 2, in the same unbleached nightdress with the ribbon at the throat, had a face her mother did not, for a long half-moment, recognize. The cheekbones stood out above the hollows. The eyes were sunk back into their sockets and glittered a little in the coal light. The hands on the counterpane were the hands of a much older woman, with the tendons showing along the backs of them, and the wedding ring turning loose on the finger. When she saw her mother in the doorway, she tried to sit up, and could not, and gave a little laugh at herself, and lifted one arm instead, and held it out. Jane Taylor came across the rug in her outdoor cloak and her bonnet, and knelt down beside the bed, and put her face against her daughter's neck, and did not speak for a long minute. She stayed. Of course she stayed. She took a small back room on the same floor, next to the nursery, and she unpacked her plain black things into the drawers of a chest of drawers there, and she put her Bible on the little table beside the bed, with her spectacles folded on top of it. And from the first night, she sat up in the front bedroom until the small hours, holding her daughter's hand between her own 2 hands. The nursemaid brought her tea at midnight. The maid, Mary MacLeod, brought her a shawl at 1. She refused both a candle and a lamp beside the bed, because Mary Jane could no longer bear a bright light in her eyes, and so she sat by the low red glow of the coals, and watched her daughter's chest rise and fall under the counterpane, and once every hour, when the retching began again, she held the basin, and wiped the mouth, and gave a spoonful of cool water from the jug. The doctor came in and out of the room across those first nights with the manner of a man grateful for help. He kissed his mother-in-law's hand at the doorway. He thanked her, aloud, for coming. He mixed the draughts himself, as he had done for weeks, at the little marble-top table under the window, with the green bottle and the small brass measuring glass, and he brought each tumbler to the bedside and gave it into Mary Jane's own hand and folded the fingers around it. Jane Taylor watched him do this, from her chair by the fire, and asked once, in a mild voice, what was in the mixture. He named it to her in Latin. He said it was a tonic for the stomach and a sedative for the nerves, and that it also carried a little quinine against the low fever. She nodded. She did not know Latin. She had no reason at all, in that first week, to doubt a physician's son-in-law in his own house. The record does not tell us the exact evening on which Jane Taylor first took a draught herself. We know that within a fortnight of her arrival she had begun to complain, in a mild, apologetic way, of a headache that would not go, and of a fluttering in her chest, and of a numbness now and then in her hands when she woke in the small of the night. The doctor was attentive. He was, if anything, more attentive to her than he had been to his own wife. He came into her little back room in his shirt-sleeves in the mornings, and took her pulse at the wrist between his own thumb and finger, and shook his head, and said that she was doing too much, and that she must be looked after in her turn, or she would fall ill as well. He gave her a small draught of his own preparation, in a wine-glass this time, sweetened with a spoonful of syrup, because her mouth was not, as her daughter's was, past the point of tasting. He watched her drink it, standing at the foot of her bed, with his hands behind his back. He asked her to tell him, in the morning, how she had slept. She slept badly, she said so. He mixed another glass. By the last week of December, she was keeping to her chair for part of the day. By the first week of January, she was keeping to her bed for the mornings. And by the middle of January 1865, the mother who had come from Edinburgh to nurse her daughter was being nursed herself in the little back room next to the nursery, by the maid Mary MacLeod carrying trays up and down the stair, and by Janey, the eldest girl, reading aloud to her from the border ballads in a hushed voice at bedside, and by her son-in-law coming in 3 or 4 times a day in his shirt sleeves to mix her another draught and to fold her fingers around it and to watch her drink. Take a breath here with me. This is the hinge of the whole story, and it happened very quietly. 2 women, mother and daughter, on the same landing of the same house, sickening in the same way at the same time, under the same careful hand. If you had walked past number 131 Sauchiehall Street on a January afternoon of that year, you would have seen only a doctor's plate on the door and a curtain drawn at an upstairs window, and you would have thought nothing of it. The people of Glasgow did think nothing of it. The neighbours brought soup. The minister of the parish called in the mornings and prayed at each bedside in turn. And the doctor, going down his stair in the evening in his good black coat, was met on the pavement by acquaintance after acquaintance who touched their hats and asked after his wife and her mother and how he himself was bearing up. And he answered them each in the same low, grave voice and said that he was doing what he could and that the rest was in God's hands. He wrote to Michael Taylor in Penrith through those weeks, and the letters have survived, and they are worse to read than any letter he wrote about his wife alone. He wrote to his brother-in-law that his own mother-in-law had unfortunately been overcome by the strain of her long vigil in the sick room, and that she had begun to show symptoms which reminded him painfully of Mary Jane's, and that he now had 2 invalids in the house instead of 1. He wrote that Jane Taylor had been in the habit for many years, as Michael knew, of taking a little laudanum against her rheumatism, and that he feared the strain of Glasgow and of the loss of sleep had led her to increase the dose. He wrote that he had taken the bottle out of her reach and was measuring the drops himself. He wrote as a physician of experience writing to another, in candour, of a difficult case. Not one word of it was true in the shape he gave it. He was giving her tartar emetic. He was giving it to her in the sweet wine glass in the mornings, and in a spoon of jelly in the afternoons, and, on at least one night that we know of from the maid's later account, in a lump of cheese he handed to her at the bedside and asked her to eat, saying that she must keep her strength up for the sake of her daughter across the landing. Jane Taylor took the cheese from his hand in the palm of her own hand. She looked at it for a moment. She said, in her plain Edinburgh voice, that she could not think what the cook had done to it, because it tasted strange. He said, in the same low, kind tone he used for everything now, that the cheese in Glasgow was often peppered more than the cheese she was used to at home, and that she should eat it, and he watched her eat it, and he took the empty plate away. The maid Mary MacLeod remembered that piece of cheese, later, in a room in the city with her hands folded in her lap. Toward the end of the 2nd week of February, Jane Taylor had a very bad night. The retching that had been going on for a fortnight became, in the small hours, a violent thing, and she cried out once for her son in Edinburgh, and once for her dead husband, and once for the parish minister. Mary MacLeod ran along the landing for the doctor. He came into the little back room in his shirt-sleeves and his slippers, and he lit the candle on the marble top, and he took his mother-in-law's pulse at the wrist for a long minute, and he laid her hand down again on the counterpane, and he said, quietly, that this was a heart attack, and that she was unlikely to see morning. He sent Mary MacLeod down for hot water and for a mustard plaster. He sat by the bed in the low light. He did not send for another doctor. He did not send for the parish minister. He did not send a telegram to Michael Taylor in Penrith. He sat, and he waited, and he mixed nothing more. At about 3 in the morning of the 25th of February, 1865, Jane Taylor, widow of Michael Taylor of Lauriston Place, Edinburgh, drew a rattling breath in the small back room next to the nursery at number 131 Sauchiehall Street, and did not draw another. Her son-in-law closed her eyes with the pads of his fingers. He folded her hands across her chest. He blew out the candle on the marble top. Then he went along the landing to the front bedroom, where his wife lay in the low red glow of the coals, and he sat down beside her, and he took her hand in his, and he told her, in the same quiet voice he had used at the bedside on the other side of the wall, that her dear mother had gone quietly to God in the night, and that she must not distress herself, and that he was there, and that everything would be seen to, Mary Jane turned her face into the pillow and wept without sound. The rain began again outside on Sauchiehall Street, on the black slates of the roof above their heads, and on the small back room where Jane Taylor lay now with a sheet drawn up to her chin. In the nursery down the passage, baby Frederick stirred in his cot and settled again. In the front bedroom, the doctor sat on beside his weeping wife with her hand in his, and he lifted the tumbler from the marble top by her elbow, and he brought it very gently toward her lips. 2 coffins in the house. I'll write chapter 6 now, keeping the pace slower than the mother's arrival chapter, and letting the 2 deaths sit with their proper weight before the letter turns everything on its axis. Stay with me for a moment before we go back inside the house. I know the last chapter ended in a hard place, in the front bedroom at 3 in the morning with a widow just dead across the passage, and if you drifted off there, please do not worry. You have missed nothing you cannot pick up from here. All you need to hold on to, as we go in through the front door on Sauchiehall Street again, is this. Jane Taylor is dead in the little back room next to the nursery. Mary Jane is alive, but only just, in the front bedroom at the top of the walnut stair, and the man of the house is downstairs already, in his good black coat, writing letters. He wrote first to Michael Taylor in Penrith, and he wrote in a hand as even as if he were setting down a shop account. The letter was on the mail south by the first collection of the 25th of February. In it, the doctor described the night with the composure of a physician of long practice. He gave the hour of death as a little after 3 in the morning. He gave the cause as apoplexy, brought on by the strain of watching over her daughter through so many weeks. He said that Jane Taylor had gone without pain, and that her last words had been of her family. He added, near the foot of the page, that he had already spoken to an undertaker in West Nile Street, and that he thought it best, if the family in Edinburgh had no objection, that his mother-in-law be carried home to Lauriston Place by the railway on the following day, and laid at last in the family lair at Grange Cemetery, beside her husband. He asked for the family's consent by return, and signed himself their sorrowing kinsman. The reply from Michael Taylor came the next morning by telegram, and it was brief, and it agreed. There was no reason yet in the mind of any tailor in Edinburgh to think this death anything other than what a Glasgow doctor said it was. Jane Taylor had been past 70. She had sat up night after night for weeks with a dying daughter. Her heart had failed her, as an older heart may fail. The younger doctor in Penrith, reading the letter over the breakfast table in his own house that morning, did not question the diagnosis of a physician who had been at the bedside. Come with me up the walnut stair again. I want you to see how the house held itself through the day that followed, because it is the last time we shall see it as a house of the living. In the little back room next to the nursery, the maid Mary MacLeod and the nursemaid Catherine Latimer washed the body of Jane Taylor together, in the manner they had been taught in the country houses where each of them had first gone into service. They took the wedding ring off the thin finger and set it into a saucer on the marble top. They combed out the grey hair and pinned it up under a clean white cap. They dressed the dead woman in her plain black gown from the press, and laid her hands one over the other on her breast, and pinned a linen cloth over the lower half of the face, because the jaw had begun to fall. They drew the sheet up to the collarbone. They lit 2 candles on the mantel and set the fire out. Then they closed the door and stood on the landing for a moment, and Mary MacLeod, who was 17, put her apron up to her face and cried without sound. The undertaker came in the late afternoon with a plain elm coffin on a handcart, and 2 men in dark coats to carry it up the stair. The doctor met them at the door in his shirt-sleeves and led them up himself. The coffin was set on 2 chairs in the little back room. Jane Taylor was lifted into it by the 2 men in dark coats, with Mary MacLeod holding the head steady in her 2 hands, as she had been told to do. The lid was rested against the wall. The doctor stood at the foot of the coffin with his hat in his hand, and looked down at his mother-in-law's face for a long moment. He did not speak. He did not weep. He turned and went out onto the landing and closed the door softly behind him, and went down the stair to write the notice for the newspapers. He passed the front bedroom on his way. He did not go in. We do not know for certain whether Mary Jane was told that day that her mother was dead in a coffin on the other side of the wall. The maid Mary MacLeod believed she was not. The nursemaid Catherine Latimer believed she was, in a softened form, by the doctor himself sitting on the edge of the bed in the late afternoon, with her hand in his. Both women were asked about it, later, in a room in the city. Both gave their answers plainly, and the two answers did not agree. It is one of the small unfixed places in this case, and I do not want to invent a certainty the record does not hold. What we do know is that at some point across the 25th and the 26th of February, Mary Jane understood, in some form her fever would let her hold, that the woman who had sat by her bed for 2 months had gone. The coffin left the house on the morning of the 27th, in a carriage draped in black, and was carried by cab and by railway van south through Battock and into Edinburgh by that afternoon. Michael Taylor met it at the platform. He had already arranged the interment at Grange Cemetery for the following day. The doctor did not travel with the body. He wrote to Michael Taylor, in a note handed to the undertaker to carry with him, that he could not in conscience leave his wife's bedside for even one night, and that he trusted his brother-in-law would understand. Michael Taylor understood. He stood alone at the graveside in Edinburgh, in a hard east wind, and watched his mother put down beside his father, and thought, for the first time in his life, that Edward Pritchard was a better husband than he had ever quite given him credit for. Come back with me now to Sauchiehall Street. There are 3 weeks left, and they are the slowest 3 weeks in this story. Mary Jane did not rise from the bed again. Through the first days of March, the retching that had been intermittent for weeks became a settled thing, coming on after each cup of anything he brought her. She could no longer keep down beef tea. She could no longer keep down water from the jug. The tumbler on the marble top stayed full for an hour at a stretch, and he would sit beside the bed with it in his own hand, and lift it to her lips, and coax her to take a mouthful. She took the mouthful, because she trusted him, and because there was nothing else in the world for her to trust. The mouthful came up an hour later, into the basin that Mary MacLeod carried away down the back stair to the scullery. The parish minister called in the mornings and knelt at the foot of the bed and prayed. The neighbours from further along Sauchiehall Street sent up jars of calf's foot jelly and pots of arrowroot with cards tucked into the string. The children were kept below stairs now, in the housekeeper's room, with a bowl of coals and a slate and a piece of chalk to keep the little ones occupied. Janey, aged 12, was allowed up in the evenings for a few minutes to sit on the edge of her mother's bed and to have her hair stroked and to be told, in a voice that no longer had much breath behind it, to be a good girl for her father. There is a detail from these weeks that has stayed with me since I first read it in a reading room on a wet afternoon, and I want to tell it to you because it is one of the small human hinges of the case. On the evening of the 14th of March, 4 days before she died, Mary Jane wrote a very short letter in pencil on the last blank page of her housekeeping ledger. It was 3 lines only. It was to her brother Michael in Penrith. It said that she felt she was not going to recover, and that she wished him to know she had thought of him and of their mother in her last weeks, and that she was leaving her wedding ring for Janey when the girl was old enough to wear it. She tore the page out of the ledger, she folded it small, she put it under the corner of the bolster on her side of the bed, and she did not give it to Mary MacLeod to post, and she did not tell her husband it was there. It stayed under that bolster until after her death, when Mary MacLeod found it, while stripping the bed, and gave it, without a word, into the hand of Michael Taylor when he arrived in Glasgow the following morning. We do not know why she did not send it in the ordinary way. It is possible she did not want him to travel north to see her die. It is possible, as some who have written on this case have argued, that she had begun by then to be afraid of her husband. In some form her fever would let her name, and did not want a letter of hers to pass through his hand on its way out of the house. I have thought about it both ways, and I have not settled it, and I do not think it can now be settled. She died in the early hours of the 18th of March, 1865. The doctor was beside her when she went. Mary MacLeod was in the room, standing by the washstand with a folded flannel in her hand. Catherine Latimer was on the landing outside with the door ajar. There was no cry and no last word that anyone in the room could later swear to. There was a long, thin breath drawn in, and held for what seemed longer than a breath should be held, and then let out in a way that had no next breath after it. The doctor kept his fingers on the pulse at the wrist for almost a full minute after that. Then he laid the hand back down on the counterpane. He turned to Mary MacLeod, and told her, in a level voice, that her mistress was gone and that she was to go down and wake the older children and to bring Janey up to say goodbye. Janey came up in her nightdress with a shawl over her shoulders. She was made to stand at the side of the bed and to kiss her mother on the forehead. Her father put a hand on her shoulder and steered her back to the doorway and told her, quietly, that she was the eldest now and that she would be a comfort to him. Then he did the thing that half of Glasgow would later argue about. He bent over the bed, in front of the maid and the nursemaid and his eldest child, and he lifted the dead face of his wife toward him in both of his hands, and he kissed her on the mouth. He held the kiss for a moment longer than the room expected. He laid the head back down on the pillow. He stood up. He straightened his coat. He walked out of the room and down the walnut stair to the consulting room to write the certificate of death, in his own hand, giving the cause as gastric fever. The coffin came the following day. It was oak this time, brass-handled, with a plate on the lid engraved with her name and the dates of her birth and her death. Mary Jane was laid in it in a white shroud with a lace edging that her mother had brought north with her from Edinburgh, still in tissue at the bottom of the trunk. On the morning of the 21st of March, the coffin was carried down the walnut stair by 4 men in dark coats, and out through the front door under the brass plate, and up onto the black draped carriage waiting at the pavement. The doctor followed it in his good black coat, with Janey by the hand, and the two of them took the mail train south that afternoon, and the coffin travelled with them in the guard's van. Michael Taylor met the train at Edinburgh. Mary Jane was laid in Grange Cemetery on the afternoon of the 22nd of March, in the same lair as her mother, 3 weeks and 1 day after Jane Taylor had been put down beside her husband there. I want you to hold Michael Taylor in your mind for a moment, as he stood at that second graveside. He was a country doctor. He had lost his mother in February and his sister in March, both to illnesses his brother-in-law had described to him at length in careful medical letters, and both of which he had accepted, at the time, in good faith. He had walked behind 2 coffins into the same plot in the space of 1 Scottish spring. He went home to Penrith on the evening train. He did not, in that first week, allow himself to think what a part of him had already begun to think. Come back with me, one more time, to Glasgow, and to a stone building on Ingram Street, on a wet morning at the end of March. There is a wooden pigeonhole in a wall behind a mahogany counter, and in that pigeonhole, on the morning we are looking at, there is a letter that came in with the first delivery of the day. It is on plain white paper. It is addressed in a hand no clerk in that office recognised. It is directed to the Procurator Fiscal of Glasgow. A clerk in a black coat took it out of the pigeonhole and slit it open with a bone paper knife. The letter was short. It was signed with a Latin phrase, 3 words, which the clerk read once and then read again more slowly. It said that Dr. Edward William Pritchard, of number 131 Sauchiehall Street, had in the past 6 weeks buried both his mother-in-law and his wife under circumstances which any honest physician in the city would recognise as suspicious, and that the writer, in the interests of justice, begged the Procurator Fiscal to look into the matter without delay. The clerk laid the letter down flat on the mahogany counter. He looked at it for a long moment in the gaslight. Then he carried it, in his 2 hands, along the corridor to the inner room, and knocked at the door, and took it in, and set it down in front of the Procurator Fiscal himself, and stood back a pace, and waited to be told what should now be done. The powder and the ledger. Come back with me now to the inner room on Ingram Street, and stand for a moment at the elbow of the man behind the desk, because everything that happens in this chapter begins from a piece of paper he is holding in his hands. His name is William Hart. He is the Procurator Fiscal for the County of Lanark, and it is his office, and no one else's, to decide whether a body that has been laid in the ground by a certificate of gastric fever ought to be lifted out of it again. He reads the letter twice. He lays it flat on the desk in front of him. He looks up at the clerk in the doorway, and he asks in a plain lowland voice, what is known in the office about a Dr. Pritchard of Sauchiehall Street? The clerk did not know very much. He knew that a plate with that name was on a door at the west end of the town. He knew that the doctor had lately buried a wife, because the notice had been in the Glasgow Herald. He did not know about the mother-in-law. He said so. William Hart sent him back out of the room, and sat on for a while by himself. I want you to hold on to how strange this moment is. A city of 500,000 people, a physician on a respectable street, with a plate on the door and a good black coat and a growing practice. 2 women dead in his house in a month. A single sheet of paper on the desk of a public official, in a hand no one recognizes, signed with 3 words of Latin that mean, more or less, that a friend of justice has written. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to fold that letter into the back of a ledger and to let the matter go. The fiscal did not fold it away. He rang the bell on his desk instead, and he sent word to Dr. James Patterson, who was one of the older physicians of Glasgow, to come to Ingram Street at his earliest convenience, and to bring his memory with him. Dr. Patterson came the same afternoon in his outdoor coat, and sat opposite William Hart, and heard the letter read aloud once. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly that he had been called to number 131 Sauchiehall Street twice in the last month by Dr. Pritchard himself, once to see the mother-in-law and once to see the wife. He said that on the first visit he had thought the old lady was under the influence of some narcotic, and had said so at the time, and had refused when it was asked of him to sign a certificate for her death. He said that on the second visit he had thought the same of the younger woman. He said that he had gone home that second night and had sat with his coat still on and had wondered, aloud, to no one but the fire, whether he ought to write a letter. He had not written it. Someone else, he told the fiscal now, had written for him. The record does not tell us whether James Patterson wrote the anonymous letter himself, or whether some other physician in the town wrote it, or whether it came from a servant, or from a neighbour, or from an apothecary who had begun to notice a pattern in his own daybook. Historians of this case have argued the question for over 150 years, and no name has ever been proved on that sheet of paper. What matters for our purposes is what William Hart did with it after Dr. Patterson had gone home. He wrote out, in his own careful hand, a warrant for the exhumation of 2 bodies, and he sent it up to the sheriff. The sheriff signed it that evening. Come with me now to a corner of Sauchiehall Cemetery, on the north edge of Glasgow, on a raw morning at the very end of March 1865. There is a low mist along the ground. There is a smell of turned earth and of coal smoke drifting from the city below. 2 gravediggers in flannel shirts are already at work on a piece of ground where a small headstone has not yet been set. A police superintendent in uniform stands beside them with his hands behind his back. Dr. Patterson is there. So is Dr. Henry Littlejohn, come through from Edinburgh at first light, who is one of the finest men in Scotland at reading what the ground has done to a body. So is a young chemist called Frederick Penny, from the Andersonian College on George Street, who has brought with him a leather bag of clean glass jars packed in straw. And so, at the edge of the small group, in a heavy overcoat with the collar up, is William Hart himself. They did not lift Jane Taylor first, they lifted Mary Jane. The coffin came up out of the ground with the ropes creaking under the weight of it. The lid was prized off there and then, on trestles set up in the grass, with a canvas rigged as a screen against the wind. The face inside was not, to the eyes of the men bending over it, the face of a woman who had died of gastric fever a week and a half earlier. The features were preserved to a degree that took the wind out of Dr. Littlejohn for a long moment. He stood up straight, and he took his hat off, and he said, in a voice the police superintendent later remembered, that this was a body that had been given something which had held it back from the ordinary course of dissolution. He asked for the samples to be taken there in the open air, and Frederick Penny knelt down beside the coffin with a set of clean instruments laid out on a linen cloth on the grass, and he began his work. He took, in that first hour, a portion of the stomach, and a portion of the liver, and a portion of the kidneys, and a length of the intestine, and a piece of muscle from the thigh, and even a small clipping of the hair. Each went into its own jar. Each jar was sealed with wax in front of William Hart, and each was labelled in Penny's own hand, and each seal was pressed with the ring of the procurator fiscal himself. The coffin was closed again. The grave was filled in. The men moved to a second piece of ground, further along the row, where the earth was newer still, and they lifted Jane Taylor. She had been in the ground longer, by 3 weeks, and the wind that morning was cold enough to keep the group at the graveside for the whole of the work. The same portions were taken. The same jars were sealed. The same ring was pressed into the same wax. By the time the men walked back down the cemetery path in the late morning, Frederick Penny was carrying, in a padded case in his own hand, tissue enough from 2 dead women to answer a question that no living doctor in Glasgow had yet been willing to ask out loud. Take a slow breath here with me. I know exhumation is a hard word to say and a hard thing to hold at the end of a day, and if you have drifted a little through the graveside part of this, that is entirely well. What you need to keep is only this. 2 bodies were taken up out of the ground. The samples were sealed. The seals went with Frederick Penny across the town to a laboratory at the Andersonian College, and by the following week, the results of his tests were being carried on foot along Ingram Street to William Hart's inner room in a folded sheet inside an envelope by Penny himself. Antimony in every jar, in stomach and liver, in kidney and muscle, in the coil of intestine, in the very hair. Antimony in Mary Jane, antimony in Jane Taylor, antimony in quantities that no honest physician in Glasgow was prescribing to any patient of his for any ailment known to the year 1865. I should tell you plainly what antimony is, because the word will keep coming through the rest of this story, and I do not want you to fall asleep on a word you cannot picture. It is a metal. In the form used by the doctor, it is a white or pale grey powder, mixed with a salt to make it dissolve. Physicians of the century did prescribe very small amounts of it, sparingly, to make a patient bring up the contents of the stomach or to bring on a sweat. Given in that small way, once or twice, it was a rough medicine that a strong body could recover from. Given in small doses again and again, day after day, hidden in wine or in food or in a sweet draught by the bed, it did to the body of a healthy adult exactly what the neighbours on Sauchiehall Street had been watching happen for months. It hollowed the person out. It thinned the flesh. It brought on the retching and the cramps and the wasting. And it did all of this in a way that looked, to a physician who did not know to look for it, indistinguishable from a slow gastric fever of the kind that carried off any number of women in any Glasgow winter. That is the drug Frederick Penny had just found in 2 exhumed bodies. That is the drug William Hart was now holding in his mind as he sent his next set of officers, in plain clothes, to walk quietly along Sauchiehall Street and into the shops. The chemists of the West End of Glasgow kept a good habit in those years. Every drug on the poisons list had to be entered in a bound daybook with the date and the name of the drug and the amount sold and the signature of the person buying it and the reason given for its purchase. The books were kept behind the counter and were open to any officer of the Crown who asked. The officers asked. They went into shop after shop that first week of April, in Sauchiehall Street and in West Nile Street and in Buchanan Street, and they turned the pages back through the winter, and they read. The name Pritchard was in every book they opened. He had bought tartar emetic from Curry, the chemist, near his own door, more than once, in the ordinary run of his practice, and had signed for it each time in a hand as neat as an examination paper. He had bought Fleming's tincture of aconite. He had bought tincture of opium in half-ounce quantities, and had signed for those as well. He had bought antimony wine. He had bought, from 3 different shops, in small purchases spaced weeks apart, more of the tartar emetic than any single physician of his practice size in Glasgow could account for by the ordinary needs of his patients. The signatures were all his. The reasons entered beside them were vague. For the surgery, for a private patient, for personal use. Come back with me one last time to number 131 Sauchiehall Street, because the officers have arrived at the door. They came on the morning of the 21st of April, 1865. There were 3 of them, in plain clothes, with a warrant in the inside pocket of the senior officer's coat. They knocked at the door of the shop, and the maid, Mary MacLeod, opened it, and stood back to let them in, when they said they wished to speak to the doctor. He came down the walnut stair in his shirt-sleeves. He was told, quietly, on the mat inside his own front door, that he was under arrest on suspicion of the murder of his wife and of his mother-in-law, and that they would trouble him for the keys of the house. He looked at the senior officer for a long moment. He did not raise his voice. He did not deny anything. He asked whether he might go upstairs and put on his coat. He was allowed to go up, with one officer at his shoulder. While he dressed, the other two men began to work through the house. They went first into the consulting room off the shop, and they took down from the shelves the leather-bound order books in which every drug bought for the practice had been entered. They went into the little dispensary at the back, and they took down the bottles ranged along the shelves, and they wrapped each one carefully in paper and set it into a wicker basket brought for the purpose. They went up the walnut stair and into the front bedroom where Mary Jane had died, and they lifted the empty tumbler from the marble top, and they took the small green bottle from the shelf above the washstand, and they folded the counterpane down and searched the drawer of the bedside table. They went along the landing to the little back room next to the nursery, and they did the same. They went down again to the housekeeper's room and asked to see the tea and the sugar and the caster of pepper on the shelf. Everything lifted, they wrapped, and everything they wrapped, they carried out. The doctor came down the stair in his good black coat, with a small carpet bag in his hand, into which he had put a nightshirt and a razor and a Bible. He kissed each of his children on the top of the head in the housekeeper's room, in front of the officers. He said a low word to Mary MacLeod at the foot of the stair, thanking her for her service. He walked out of his own front door onto the pavement of Sauchiehall Street between two men in plain coats, and he was helped up into a closed cab waiting at the curb. The cab pulled away west, then turned south, toward the North Prison at Duke Street. Behind him, in the tall, thin house he had walked out of, the officers went on with their work into the afternoon. The wicker basket filled with bottles. The order books went into a canvas bag with a wax seal on the tie. The tumbler from the front bedroom, and the small green bottle, and the caster of pepper from the housekeeper's shelf, all went into a wooden box lined with straw. Everything was carried down the walnut stair a second time that day, and out through the door under the brass plate, and loaded into a second cab, and driven along Sauchiehall Street toward the Andersonian College, where Frederick Penny was already waiting at his bench, with a fresh set of clean jars. By the following morning the news was in every paper in Scotland. By the end of the week it was in the papers of London and Dublin and New York. And in a cell in Duke Street, in a heavy grey coat with the collar up against the damp of the walls, Edward William Pritchard sat on the edge of a wooden bunk and waited, in the calm way he had always waited for anything, for the men from the Crown to come and begin, in earnest, to ask him their questions. The trial at Edinburgh. Come with me now up out of the west and across the country, because the story is leaving Glasgow for a while. It is not going home. It is going to a courtroom in a city that in 1865 still ran most of the great criminal trials of Scotland, and it is going in the custody of two officers in dark coats on a slow morning train out of Queen Street. Edward Pritchard was moved from the North Prison at Duke Street on the last day of June 1865, 10 weeks after the officers had walked him out of his own front door. He travelled in a first-class compartment with the blinds drawn, one officer opposite him and one beside him, and he did not speak for most of the journey. He had asked for a Bible before they left the cell, and he read it, or held it open on his knee, from Motherwell to Carstairs. At Carstairs the train turned east onto the Edinburgh line, and the country outside the window flattened and greened, and he closed the book and looked out for a while at the fields. I want you to picture Edinburgh as it stood that summer, because the city itself was part of the pressure on him. The High Court sat in an old stone building on Parliament Square, behind the great grey bulk of St Giles, a short walk from the smoke of the old town and the terraces of the new. The courtroom itself was modest by the standard of a modern hall of justice. The dock stood at the centre of a wooden floor, penned in by iron, with a chair for the accused and a rail at chest height. The judge's bench rose at one end under a canopy of dark oak. The public gallery ran round three sides, and it held, on the morning the trial opened, every seat filled by 8:30, with a crowd on the pavement outside, all the way down the west bow. They came to see the doctor. The trial began on Monday the 3rd of July, and it ran for 5 days. On the bench sat the Lord Justice Clerk, John Inglis, who was the second most senior judge in Scotland, and one of the finest legal minds in the country. Beside him sat Lord Ardmillan and Lord Jerviswood. For the Crown appeared the Lord Advocate himself, George Young, with 2 juniors at his back. For the defence stood Andrew Rutherford Clark, a Glasgow-born advocate, who had been briefed only a matter of weeks before, and who had, by his own admission afterward, taken the case knowing that his client could not sensibly be defended on the facts alone. Pritchard was brought up from the cells at 10 o'clock. He wore his good black coat, the same one, some in the courtroom later said, that he had walked in behind the coffin of his wife in March. His beard had been trimmed, his hair had been combed. He stepped up into the dock without help and stood at the rail with his hands folded loosely in front of him. The clerk read out the two indictments. The murder of Jane Taylor of Edinburgh by the wilful and repeated administration of antimony in Glasgow between the 12th of February and the 25th of February, 1865. The murder of Mary Jane Pritchard, his wife, by the wilful and repeated administration of antimony and aconite in Glasgow between the 1st of November, 1864 and the 18th of March, 1865. He was asked how he pleaded to each. He answered, in a voice that carried to the back of the room without effort, that he was not guilty. The Lord Justice Clerk made a mark on the paper in front of him. The Lord Advocate rose. I will not walk you through every witness in the order they were called, because there were more than 100 of them, and a sleep narration is no place for a full brief of counsel. What I want to give you instead is the shape of it. The Crown built the case in 3 braided threads, and it laid them one over the other across 5 days until the weight of them was more than any jury in Scotland could set aside. The first thread was the medicine itself. Frederick Penny went into the witness box on the second day, in his frock coat and his spectacles, and he was on his feet for the best part of a full session. He spoke without ornament about the antimony he had found in Mary Jane's stomach and liver, and about the antimony he had found in Jane Taylor's flesh and hair, and he gave his figures in grains and in fractions of grains, and he spoke of aconite as well, which he had found in traces in the wife's tissues but not the mother's. He was cross-examined at length by Rutherford Clarke, who tried, in the manner of a good defender with a hard brief, to shake the chemist on the reliability of his methods. Penny did not shake. He answered every question in the same even tone with which he had answered the first, and he left the box, an hour and a half later, with the antimony still firmly in the tissues of 2 dead women, and with no honest doubt at all in the mind of the jury as to whether it had been put there by accident. The second thread was the account books. Come with me here for a moment, because this is the part of the case that always stayed with me most. Along a bench at the side of the court, in front of the Lord Advocate's clerks, were stacked the day books of 6 chemists' shops in the West End of Glasgow, and beside them lay the leather-bound order books, taken out of the doctor's own consulting room. The Lord Advocate went through them, page by page, in front of the jury. Every purchase of tartar emetic, every purchase of Fleming's tincture, every purchase of antimonial wine, every signature in the doctor's neat hand, every vague reason entered beside them in his own writing. He held one book open toward the jury at arm's length and asked them to look, and they looked. The books were not clever, they were not medical, they were only ink on ruled paper, in the hand of a physician, showing, over the winter of 1864 and into the spring of 1865, the steady accumulation, from 3 separate premises, spaced weeks apart, of enough poison to kill everyone in the house on Sauchiehall Street twice over. The third thread was the women who had lived in that house. I want you to hold on to the maids for a moment, because they are the human centre of the trial, and their evidence was the part of it that the newspapers of the time went home and printed word for word. Mary MacLeod went into the box on the 3rd day. She was still 17. She wore a dark dress and her country cap. She was frightened almost past speech at the beginning, and the Lord Advocate gave her a full minute before he began, and asked her the first question in a voice she later said had been the kindest thing anyone said to her that summer. She told the court what she had seen, the tumbler on the marble top in the front bedroom, and the doctor mixing it with his own hand from the little green bottle on the shelf above the washstand, the suppers he had carried up on a tray for his mother-in-law and would not let anyone else touch, the retching in the basins she had carried down the back stair to the scullery, the kiss on the mouth of the dead woman in front of Janey and Catherine Latimer. She told the court, when she was asked, that on more than one night in the winter, when the mistress was very ill in the front bedroom, the doctor had come into the housekeeper's room where she slept, and had sat on the edge of her bed, and had kissed her, and had told her that when Mary Jane was dead he would marry her, and that she would be the new mistress of the house. The courtroom did not move. The Lord Advocate let the silence sit for a long moment. Then he asked her, very softly, whether she had ever told anyone about that promise. She said she had told no one. She had been ashamed, and she had been afraid to lose her place, and she had thought, at the beginning, that her mistress was dying of a natural illness, and that the doctor's grief for her was real. It was only after the arrest, she said, and after she had sat alone in a room with a police officer and had been asked ordinary questions in an ordinary voice, that she had understood, for the first time, what part her own body had played in the story going on above her head in the front bedroom. Catherine Latimer, the nursemaid, followed her into the box and gave a shorter account, and confirmed the tumblers and the trays and the kiss. Dr. Patterson gave the medical evidence he had refused to give in Sauchiehall Street the previous winter, and he gave it now under oath and without hesitation. Michael Taylor came up from Penrith and told the court, in a voice that broke twice, about the letters he had received from his brother-in-law through February and March, and about standing at the two gravesides at Grange Cemetery, 3 weeks apart, with an east wind coming in off the Firth. Through all of it, the doctor sat in the dock behind the iron rail, with his hands folded in front of him, and he watched. There is a detail I want to give you, from the notes of a reporter for the Glasgow Herald, who sat in the press gallery for every day of the trial, because it is the sort of thing that only a person who has watched a face for 5 days can see. On the first day, and through most of the second, the reporter wrote, Dr. Pritchard's expression did not alter. He looked at each witness as they spoke. He wrote occasional notes with a pencil on a pad his counsel had passed up to him. He did not weep. He did not colour. He looked, the reporter wrote, exactly as he had looked in his own consulting room to a nervous patient. On the afternoon of the third day, during Mary MacLeod's evidence, that expression began, for the first time, to falter, not into rage and not into grief, into a kind of held stillness, the reporter wrote, as of a man realizing, in a place he could not leave, that a thing he had believed to be private was being spoken aloud, in his own hearing, in a room full of strangers. He never fully recovered his composure after that afternoon. On the fourth day the defence opened. Rutherford Clarke did what a good advocate does with a case he cannot win. He worked on the edges. He suggested that Mary MacLeod's evidence was tainted by her own involvement, and that a young woman in her position had reason to shape her account against her master. He suggested that the antimony in Mary Jane could have entered her body by accidental means, through the medicines she had been given for months in good faith. He called 2 character witnesses from Glasgow, who spoke well of the doctor's practice and of his manner toward his patients. He kept his voice level. He did not, on any question the record has preserved, ask his client to give evidence in his own defence, because under the law of Scotland at that date, the accused could not, and even if he could have, no counsel worth his brief would have put Edward Pritchard into that box under George Young's cross-examination. The Lord Advocate closed for the Crown on the morning of the 5th day. He spoke for 3 hours. He walked the jury back through the medicine, the order books, the maids and the deaths, and he laid them one over the other again in front of them, and he asked them, at the end, whether any 12 reasonable men, hearing what they had heard, could believe that Jane Taylor and Mary Jane Pritchard had died of anything other than the wilful and repeated poisoning by the hand of the man in the dock. Rutherford Clarke rose after him, and did his best, and sat down again. The Lord Justice Clerk began his charge in the early afternoon. John Inglis was not a judge who raised his voice. He was known through Scotland for the evenness of his summings up, and for his fairness to accused persons of every kind. He told the jury, in the calm way of a man who has done this work for many years, that the burden of proof lay on the Crown, and that the standard of proof was beyond reasonable doubt, and that they were not to convict on suspicion however strong, or on character however poor. Then, having said that, he walked them through the evidence for close to 3 hours, and he did it in a way that left no honest listener in the courtroom in any doubt about what verdict the evidence would bear. The jury retired at 7:20 in the evening. They were away for 55 minutes. They came back into the courtroom at 8:15. The gaslight was full on by then, and the wooden benches of the public gallery were still packed to the door. The foreman rose. The clerk asked, on the first charge, how they found. The foreman answered, guilty, by unanimous verdict. The clerk asked, on the second charge. Guilty by unanimous verdict, the foreman said again. The doctor did not move. The Lord Justice Clerk let a moment pass. He asked the prisoner whether he had anything to say why sentence of death should not now be pronounced upon him. Edward Pritchard rose from the wooden chair in the dock. He set his hands on the iron rail. He looked once, for a long second, at John Inglis on the bench, and he said, in a voice that was still, remarkably, the voice of a physician steadying a nervous patient, that he had nothing to say. The black cap was placed on the Lord Justice Clerk's head. The sentence was pronounced in the old Scottish form, that he be taken from that place to the prison from which he came, and thence to a place of public execution, and there hanged by the neck until dead, and his body afterward buried within the precincts of the prison, and that God, in his mercy, have mercy upon his soul. The court rose. The doctor was helped down out of the dock by 2 officers. He was taken, in a closed cab, west out of Edinburgh that same night, back along the line he had come up 10 weeks before, and by the small hours of the following morning he was in a condemned cell in the South Prison in Glasgow, on the north side of Jail Square, with the iron door shut behind him and the key already turned. He sat on the edge of a plank bed in that cell in his good black coat, and he asked the warder, in a level voice, whether he might be brought paper and ink. The confession in the cell. Come with me now to a room the general public of Glasgow was never allowed to see. It is a stone cell on the north side of Jail Square, in the condemned wing of the South Prison, and it measures about 8 feet by 12. There is a plank bed against one wall, with a straw mattress and 2 grey blankets. There is a wooden stool. There is a table under the barred window, high up near the ceiling, through which no view of the city is possible, only a piece of pale sky. On the table, in the first light of the 10th of July, 1865, lies a stack of ruled paper, a bottle of black ink, and a plain steel-nibbed pen. Beside the paper sits a Bible, worn at the corners, with a piece of blue silk ribbon marking a page in the Psalms. And on the plank bed, in his shirt-sleeves for the first time in weeks, sits Edward William Pritchard. He had been in that cell for 6 nights already. The trial verdict had come down on the Friday. He had been brought back to Glasgow through the small hours of the Saturday. The chaplain of the prison, the Reverend Robert Story Oldham of the Scottish Episcopal Church, had come to him on the Sunday afternoon, in a black coat and a white collar, and had sat with him for close to 2 hours. The doctor had asked, at the end of that first visit, for paper and for ink. The warder had brought them the same evening, and on the Monday morning, in the first grey wash of light through the barred window near the ceiling, the doctor set the pen to the top of a clean sheet, and he began to write. You should know, before we go any further, that what he wrote first was a lie. I want you to sit with that plainly, because everything else in this chapter turns on it. The first document he set down, in his own neat physician's hand, on ruled prison paper, was a statement blaming Mary MacLeod for the deaths of both women. He wrote that the young maid had, without his knowledge, put antimony into the food and drink of his wife and of his mother-in-law. He wrote that she had done it out of a jealous wish to become mistress of the house. He signed his name at the foot of the page. He asked the warder, when the sheet was dry, to see that it was carried to the office of his solicitor. The chaplain read a copy of that first statement the following afternoon. Reverend Oldham was a mild man, but not a gullible one, and the record has preserved a note in his own hand, made that evening at his own fireside in the woodside, in which he wrote that he did not believe a word of it. He came back to the cell the next morning. He did not accuse the doctor. He did not raise his voice. He sat down on the wooden stool beside the plank bed, and he opened the Bible on his knee, and he read aloud a passage from the 51st Psalm, in the plain version of the book. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. Wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. He read the passage twice through, quietly, and then he closed the book, and he waited. The doctor did not answer him that day, nor the next. On the third morning, which was the Thursday, he asked the chaplain, without preamble, whether a man who had killed one person and confessed to it could be forgiven, if the confession were true. Reverend Oldham said that he believed such a thing was possible, but that the confession must be truthful in every part, and that a half-confession was, in his view, no confession at all. The doctor was silent for a long moment. Then he asked for more paper. 2 days later, on the Saturday morning, he handed to the warder a second document, in the same neat hand. This one was longer. In it he admitted that he had given antimony to his wife Mary Jane Pritchard, and that he had done it with the intention of bringing about her death. He did not, in this second paper, admit to the poisoning of his mother-in-law. Jane Taylor, he wrote, had come to Sauchiehall Street already in poor health, and had died, he still maintained, of a natural cause, aggravated by the laudanum she took for her own habit. He signed the paper. He asked that it, too, be sent to his solicitor. The record does not tell us what Reverend Oldham said on his next visit when he was shown a copy. It only tells us that he came, and that he sat again on the wooden stool with the Bible on his knee, and that the door of the cell closed behind him for close to 3 hours. When the warder came to fetch the chaplain at the changing of the guard, the doctor was seated at the table under the barred window with his head in his hands. The chaplain was standing beside him, with a hand set, very lightly, on the physician's shoulder. Neither man was speaking. I want you to pause here with me for a moment, because I do not want to walk over this next part quickly. 2 women had died in his house. A young servant had died before them in the fire in the attic, and a great many historians of this case have come to believe, though it was never proved in court, that Elizabeth Magraine was the first of the 3, and that the fire was set to hide what had been done to her. The doctor in the cell was, on any honest reading of the evidence, a man who had killed at least twice, and possibly 3 times, in cold rooms, over slow months, by his own hand. And what the chaplain was trying to do, in that stone cell in the South Prison, was not to secure a conviction, because the conviction was already secured, and it was not to comfort the doctor's family, because the family had already been broken beyond the reach of comfort. He was trying, in the theology of his own church, to save one man's soul at the very last inch of the corridor. Whether he succeeded is a question the record does not answer, and I do not think any historian can answer it either. What the record does show is that on the following Monday morning, the 17th of July, Edward William Pritchard asked for a 3rd sheet of paper. He wrote his final confession in one sitting. In it, he admitted the murder of Mary Jane Pritchard, his wife, by the repeated administration of antimony and, at the very end, of aconite. He admitted the murder of Jane Taylor, his mother-in-law, by the repeated administration of antimony over the 4 weeks she had lain in the little back room next to the nursery. He did not, even in this last paper, admit in plain words to the death of Elizabeth Magraine in the fire the previous year. He wrote that he had been the cause of the fire, and that he had left the house on the night in question, and that he had gone up the walnut stair when he returned, and had passed the attic door, and that he had, in his own words, taken no steps to save the servant girl in the room beyond it. The record has preserved that phrase exactly. Whether he set the fire with his own hand, or only left the young woman to die once it had begun, he did not say. It is the one part of the story on which the sources give us less than we would want, and I think, honestly, less than he wanted us to have. He wrote the reasons at the end. There was no single reason. He wrote of debts. He wrote of a wish to marry Mary MacLeod, which he described, with the calmness of a man writing about someone else, as a passing fancy that had been given more weight in his mind than it deserved. He wrote of a habit of using chloroform on himself, at his own consulting room table, in the evenings after his patients had gone home, and of the ways in which that habit had, over the years, altered his judgment of what he was doing to other people. He wrote of a fear of his wife's family, and of a wish to be free of them, and of a growing conviction, through the winter of 1864, that if his mother-in-law were removed from the house, first the death of his wife would attract less attention. He wrote, on the last page, that he was sorry. He did not use the word grief. He used the word sorry, He signed the paper. He blotted it. He set the pen back in the inkwell. Reverend Oldham read the third confession the following morning. He read it twice through, in the chaplain's small room next to the governor's office, with the door shut. He did not, on this occasion, say what he thought of it. He put the paper into his own leather portfolio. He walked back along the stone corridor to the condemned cell. He sat on the wooden stool. He did not open the Bible on his knee. He said, quietly, that he believed him now. Come away with me for one moment, because there is a piece of this story that took place outside the walls of the prison, and I do not want to leave it out. In a house on Great Western Road, the 4 surviving Pritchard children were being cared for by their aunt, Mary Jane's sister, who had come up from Penrith at the beginning of the summer. Jane and Charles and Adelaide, and small Frederick, who was not quite 3 years old, and did not yet understand where either of his parents had gone. The aunt did not bring them to the prison. She was asked, later, by a reporter from the Glasgow Herald, whether she had considered it. She said that she had considered it and had decided against it. She said that a father who had done what their father had done had, in her view, forfeited the right to say goodbye. She said this without raising her voice, on the pavement outside the church, on a Sunday morning, and the reporter wrote her words down, exactly as she gave them, and printed them the following day. The doctor, in his cell, did not ask for the children, not once in the whole of that final week. The record is plain on this point. He asked for the chaplain. He asked in the last days for a barber to come in and trim his beard. He asked for a clean shirt for the Friday morning. He did not ask for the children. I have thought about that absence a great deal, and I do not want to explain it to you. I want to leave it where the record leaves it, which is on a page of the prison day book, in the plain hand of the warder, listing every request the condemned man made across the last 7 days of his life. The list is not long. There are no children on it. The days grew shorter and shorter inside the cell, in the way days always seem to grow shorter when there are few of them left. The chaplain came in the morning, and again in the evening. The prison surgeon came once a day, felt the pulse at the wrist, looked into the eyes, wrote a line in a book, and went away again. The warder brought the meals on a tin tray. The doctor ate very little through the last week, but he did drink the tea, and he asked, one evening, whether a piece of sugar might be spared for it, and the warder brought him 2 lumps on a saucer the next morning, without being asked again. There are little kindnesses like that all through the prison record of that final week, from men whose names are not remembered by history. I like knowing they were there. It does not change what was going to happen on the Friday morning, but it changes, a little, the shape of the nights that came before it. On the Wednesday evening, the 26th of July, the chaplain sat with him for the whole of the night. He came into the cell after the 8 o'clock bell, and he did not leave it until the first light was showing again in the piece of sky above the barred window. They read together from the Book of Common Prayer. They read the Litany for the Dying and the 51st Psalm again, and they read from the 15th chapter of the Gospel according to Luke, which is the chapter with the story of the son who was lost and who came home. Reverend Oldham later wrote to a friend that the doctor had wept for the first time that night, quietly, into the sleeve of his shirt, and that he had asked, near the end of it, whether God would forgive a man who had done what he had done. The chaplain had answered that he did not know the mind of God, but that he believed it was a mercy larger than any of them could measure, and that a man's part in it was only to be honest at the end. The doctor said that he had, at the very end, tried to be honest. The chaplain did not answer that. He turned the page of the prayer book. He read on. Outside the walls of the South Prison, in the streets of Glasgow, the carpenters had already begun to work. In a yard behind the prison offices, under a canvas sheet, a wooden platform was being fitted together in pieces, with iron pins driven through the joints, and the pieces were being carried across, at night, to the open ground of Jail Square. The gallows itself was coming up by the mail train from London, in the care of a man named William Calcraft, who had been the public executioner for the whole of England for close to 40 years, and who was known throughout Britain, in 1865, as the last of the old rope hangmen. He was expected in Glasgow on the Thursday evening, and on the pavements around Jail Square, from noon on the Thursday onward, the people of the city were already beginning, quietly and in ones and twos, to gather. The Green on Jail Square. Come with me now to the last morning of this story. It is the 28th of July, 1865, and it is not yet 4 in the morning, and the sky over Glasgow is the colour of wet slate. The rain has held off for 2 days. The wind has dropped. The gas lamps along the Salt Market are still burning, and their yellow light is thinning against the first grey wash of the sky. There is nothing to see yet in Jail Square, on the north edge of Glasgow Green, except a wooden platform standing under a canvas sheet, and 2 policemen walking a slow circle around it, their boots ringing on the flags. But if you listen, and you have to listen for it, because the city has not yet fully woken, you can hear, coming in from every direction, the sound of feet. They had begun to arrive the night before. Some had walked in from the villages beyond Rutherglen. Some had come down from Anderston and Cowcaddens in 2s and 3s. Some had come by the last omnibus from the west, and had bedded down in the doorways of the Salt Market, rather than lose their place at the front. By first light there were already thousands of them, standing shoulder to shoulder in the great open ground of the Green, facing the north wall of the South Prison and the empty platform in front of it. By 6 o'clock in the morning the crowd stretched back as far as the Nelson Monument. By 7, the newspapers of the following day would estimate nearly 100,000 men, women and children had gathered in front of the gallows. I want you to hold that number for a moment with me. Glasgow at that date held about 450,000 souls in all. Nearly a quarter of the entire population of the city had come out, on foot, in the dark hours of a Friday morning, to stand on wet grass and watch a man die. Inside the prison, in the cell we sat in through the last chapter, Edward William Pritchard was already awake. He had slept, the chaplain later wrote, for perhaps 3 hours. He had been given a fresh shirt on the Thursday evening, and it lay folded on the wooden stool beside the plank bed. At 4:30 the warder brought in a jug of hot water and a razor and a cake of yellow soap, and the doctor washed his face and his hands, and he shaved himself in the polished tin plate that had been left for the purpose. He put on the fresh shirt, he put on the black waistcoat and the black trousers and the good black coat that he had worn in the dock at Edinburgh. He asked for his hair to be combed, and it was combed for him. He asked whether his boots had been brushed, and they had been. He sat down on the edge of the plank bed and waited. Reverend Oldham came in at 6. They knelt together on the stone floor. The chaplain read the order for the visitation of the sick from the Book of Common Prayer, in the plain version, and then he read again from the 51st Psalm, which the doctor now knew by heart. Have mercy upon me, O God. Wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity. Cast me not away from thy presence. When the reading was done, they took the sacrament of bread and wine together, at the deal table under the barred window. The doctor's hand, the chaplain later wrote, was steady when he lifted the cup. At 7:30, the governor of the prison came into the cell in his black coat. He was accompanied by the town clerk and by the 2 magistrates who were required, under the law, to witness the passing of the sentence. Behind them, at a distance of 2 paces, stood a stout Englishman with grey side whiskers and a black leather bag, whose name the doctor already knew. William Calcraft was 65 years old. He had been the public executioner for London and much of England since 1829, and he had by that morning hanged, on his own count, over 300 men and women in the course of his working life. He set his bag on the table under the barred window. He opened it. He took out a coil of white rope and a length of leather strap and a plain cotton cap. The doctor rose from the plank bed and stepped forward without being asked. He held out his hands, and they were bound together in front of him at the wrists with the leather strap. He said, in a level voice, that he would give no trouble. The procession formed in the corridor outside the cell at 10 minutes to 8. The governor went first, with the town clerk beside him. Then came the 2 magistrates. Then came Reverend Oldham, in his black coat and his white collar, holding the open prayer book at chest height. Then came the doctor, bareheaded, with his bound hands held in front of him and his eyes lowered to the flags of the corridor. Then came William Calcraft, half a pace behind, with the coil of rope over his forearm and the cotton cap in his hand. 2 warders walked at either side. The heavy iron door at the end of the corridor was already standing open. Beyond it lay the yard. Beyond the yard lay a low wooden door set into the north wall of the prison, and beyond that door lay the platform and the crowd on Glasgow Green. The chaplain began to read aloud from the burial service as they walked. "I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live." The words carried in the stone of the corridor. The doctor kept his eyes on the flags. He did not raise them until the low wooden door was opened, and the morning light came in on his face. The crowd on the green had been talking, in the loose murmur of 100,000 voices, until the door in the wall began to open. Then, all at once, the murmur went out. A witness who was standing near the front of the crowd, an apprentice printer of 19, later wrote to his mother that he had not, before that morning, understood that a gathering of that size could fall entirely silent. He wrote that it was the silence, more than anything else, that stayed with him afterward. The procession climbed the wooden steps of the platform in single file. The governor took his place at one side. The magistrates and the town clerk took theirs at the other. The chaplain stood beside the doctor and continued to read from the burial service in a voice that could not, from the ground, be quite made out over the timbers of the platform. The doctor was placed on the trapdoor, facing the crowd, with his bound hands held loosely in front of him. Calcraft moved behind him. He drew the cotton cap down over the doctor's face in a single motion. He set the noose about the neck and adjusted the knot behind the left ear, in the manner he had used at every hanging he had performed for close to 40 years. The chaplain closed the book. "I am going to stop for a moment now because I want to be honest with you about the next part. What William Calcraft did on the platform in Glasgow that morning was, as I have said, the last public hanging the city would ever hold. Calcraft was not, by the standards of the trade, a merciful man. He worked on what was called the short drop, which used a fall of only a foot or two, and which meant that most of the men and women he hanged died slowly, of strangulation, over a matter of minutes rather than in the sudden break of the neck that the longer drops of the following decade would give. The doctor on the Glasgow platform did not die at once. I am not going to describe what the crowd saw in the 90 seconds that followed the fall of the trap. It is in the newspapers of the 29th of July, if you want to find it. I do not think you need to hear it here, and I do not think it would help you sleep, and I do not, honestly, think it is the part of this story that matters. What matters is what happened afterward. When the surgeon had climbed the wooden steps, and had felt the wrist of the man on the rope, and had turned to the governor, and had nodded once, and when the black flag had been run up on the pole above the prison wall, the crowd on Glasgow Green began, very slowly, to disperse. They did not cheer, they did not shout. The apprentice printer, in his letter to his mother, wrote that a great many people around him were weeping, and that he did not himself understand what they were weeping for, whether for the 2 dead women, or for the 4 orphaned children in the house on Great Western Road, or for the man on the rope, or for something older and larger than any of them, that had happened in front of them and could not now be unhappened. They walked back toward the salt market in 1s and 2s. Some walked without a word. Some spoke in low voices. By 10 in the morning the green was almost empty, and the wind, which had risen a little, was moving over the wet grass where nearly 100,000 people had stood. The body of Edward William Pritchard was cut down at 9 o'clock. It was carried back through the door in the north wall, and laid on a plank in an outhouse in the prison yard, and washed, and wrapped in a plain white sheet. At 2 in the afternoon it was buried, without ceremony and without a marker, inside the walls of the South Prison, in accordance with the sentence of the court. The grave was filled in, and the flags were replaced over it. In the years that followed, when the South Prison itself was pulled down and the ground was cleared, the bones were lifted along with those of the other men and women who had been buried there under the same sentence, and were reinterred together in a single unmarked plot, and there they rest still. Glasgow never held another public hanging. 3 years later, in 1868, the Parliament at Westminster passed the Act that ended public executions everywhere in Britain, and every hanging after that date was carried out inside the walls of a prison, in front of the governor and the chaplain and a handful of official witnesses, and no more. The crowd on Glasgow Green that morning was the last of its kind the city would ever see. I want to leave you with the children before we close. The 4 surviving Pritchards were taken back to Edinburgh by their aunt in the autumn of 1865. She raised them in her own household. She did not, as far as the record shows, tell them for many years what their father had done, though they must have learned it in time, in the way that children of infamous parents always eventually learn. Jane, the eldest, married a solicitor in Edinburgh and lived a long ordinary life, and died in the 2nd decade of the following century. Charles went out to India and did not come back. Adelaide married and had children of her own, and the descendants of those children are alive today in cities scattered across the English-speaking world, and I do not know their names, and I would not give them if I did. Frederick, the baby who had been in his cot upstairs on the night his mother died, lived to be an old man, and never, in any letter that has survived, spoke his father's name aloud. The house at number 131, Sauchiehall Street, was sold. The brass plate was taken down. The consulting room where the order books had been kept was let, in time, to a milliner. The building itself was pulled down in the years between the wars, and the site is occupied now, in our own day, by an ordinary commercial premises, and no one who passes it on the pavement has any reason to know what happened there in the winter of 1864. Come back to the room with me now. The night has gone on around us while I have been telling you this. If you are still awake, thank you for staying. If you are half asleep already, that is exactly as it should be, and you do not need to hear the last of it clearly. I am only saying, as I always say at the end, that the past is very large, and that the people in it were real, and that the 2 women who died in that tall, thin house in Glasgow, Mary Jane Pritchard and Jane Taylor, deserved better than they were given, and that the young servant in the attic, Elizabeth McGrain, deserved better still. History does not always give us the ending we would want. It only gives us the ending that happened, and asks us to hold it truthfully, for a little while, before the light comes back. The candle in the room here has burned very low. The rain has begun again outside, faint against the glass. Somewhere in the city where you are lying, a clock is striking the hour, and no one is counting the strokes. Sleep well. I will be here again tomorrow night, with another story from the old dark corners of the world. And history, once again, turns the page in the dark.